Hello and welcome to this video on Tony Harrison, the Northern poet. Today we're going to be talking about V, and I'm just going to give you an introduction and an overview to the poem. Now, as you're watching, I would recommend that you take Cornell notes, and our Cornell notes come in three different sections. The main section is the notes where you'll be bullet pointing. Don't write down everything I say, but bullet point, summarize as you go. Then leave it for a little bit and go back to it and pull out the key words in your second column. And then, after a little bit of time again, use those keywords to write a 3-sentence summary of this lecture. Now, the reason why we do it like that is that it really helps to embed it in your long-term memory, because you're leaving a gap and then you're revisiting and refreshing the information and doing something new with it. Okay, so before we get into the poem itself, we're going to talk about the responses to it. Now, V has a lot of swear words in it, has quite a lot of controversial material in it, and it was kind of originally written in 1985, and then it was recorded for television, and it was performed on Channel 4. And when that happened, when it was broadcast, it was incredibly controversial. The Daily Mail, for example, called it a torrent of filth, and many viewers complained about the number of swear words in the poem. Now, some people recognise that actually the swear words are integral to the poem's meaning, and for example, journalist Bernard Levin described it as a meticulously controlled yell of rage and hope combined. This is a really angry poem because Harrison feels like the North was let down by the government. It's written during the time of the mining strikes, and there's a lot of conflict between the working classes and the police and the government and so on. Bernard Levin also said that the poem explores the waste of human potential, and that'll be quite a familiar idea to you if you've already read the poem marked with D, because in that poem, Harrison is talking about his father's death, and he talks about his father's death in a way that the father feels like he's wasted his life. At the end of the poem, it describes his father as feeling like some dull oaf. And the poem suggests that he was made to feel that way by England. Now, England in that poem represents the education system, the government, the employment system, the benefit system, all of those kind of institutions that we have in our country. And the poem suggests that actually Harrison's father had a lot of potential. He was a really good baker, a really talented man, but he was made to feel like he was dull, made to feel like he was stupid and wasting his life. And we see this same theme coming through in V. Okay, first task for you to do then is to pause the video and write down all of the things that you think that V could mean, and then start the video again when you are ready. Welcome back. Right, here's my ideas. So the first thing, the most important thing that V means in the poem is versus, in the sense of opposition, conflict. So in the poem, it talks about male versus female, the working classes versus the upper classes, different football teams versus another football team. Then we have the sense of victory. So after World War II, putting your fingers in a V sign with the inside of your palm facing forward stands for victory. So that's the sense of hope that kind of comes through towards the end of the poem. If you turn your hand round and do it the other way, it is an offensive hand gesture, which you'll see if you watch the televised version, the Channel 4 version, which is available on YouTube, by the way. So it's an offensive hand gesture. So again, we're back to that kind of opposition, that conflict, that anger, that frustration. It's also sexist graffiti. Now, this isn't really very common anymore, but in the 1980s, if you put a line down the middle of the V and drew it like that with that extra line, it would represent an aspect of female anatomy. So that would be the sexist graffiti that we might see. Okay, this particular poem then is set in a graveyard. So same thing, stop the video, and I want you to think of all the different things that a graveyard could suggest or symbolize or represent, and then start the video again when you're ready. Right, you might have some different things to what I have, and that is absolutely fine. There are so many things that we could say about this particular idea. I'm just going to run through my ideas. So we have death, endings, and mourning, that real sense of loss that is symbolised in a graveyard, and loss as well. This graveyard setting could be an allusion to Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Graveyard. Now, allusion means a reference to another text. And so Thomas Gray's poem, An Elegy in a Country Graveyard, is a poem remembering someone. It's a poem which is kind of meditative and mournful, quite a quiet poem, which is kind of hinted at in the graveyard setting of Tony Harrison's poem. However, Harrison's poem is very, very different. It is angry. It is has got quite kind of aggressive language in lots of parts of it, which would be very different from Thomas Gray's poem. Graveyard is also about commemoration. It's a place where we remember the dead, and that's one of the things that Harrison does at the start of V, is he runs through a list of people who are buried in this area beside his parents, and he talks about their professions as well. He's commemorating what these people have contributed towards society. And you can then see a history of a community. You have the butcher, the baker, the publican in the graveyard that Harrison's talking about, and these are all people who have been an integral part of that community. And there's that sense of respect again. In V, that respect is destroyed because the skinheads have been through and aerosoled swear words, graffitied them on the headstones. So there's a real sense of frustration at this kind of behaviour as well in the poem. Thinking about the context then, so it was written, as I've already mentioned, during the 84 to 85 miners' strikes. That is referenced at the start of the poem. There's a reference to Arthur Scargill, who is the leader of the NUM. It's set in Holbeck Cemetery in the Beeston area of Leeds, so it's up on a hill and it's overlooking the Elland Road football ground and the area where Harrison grew up. And underneath that cemetery, there are old mine shafts, which Harrison talks about as well. He almost imagines the graves collapsing down into the mine shafts. And the poem, as I've mentioned as well, was inspired by the desecration of his parents' graves, the graffiti that was sprayed over them. And the recording was broadcast on Channel 4 in 1987. Now, the fact that it was broadcast on Channel 4 is really quite important because that channel was created as an alternative to mainstream broadcasting. So you have the BBC, Channels 1 and Channel 2, give this very kind of traditional view of British culture. And actually, Channel 4 was created to give a voice to a wider range of voices and identities in society. And actually, we still kind of see that today. The BBC is a very traditional channel. Channel 4 is a little bit more edgy. And this broadcast caused a lot of controversy because of the profanities. There was, in fact, a group of Conservative MPs who brought a television obscenity motion to the Houses of Parliament. So this particular poem really made waves in the political sphere as well. Some new vocabulary for you then. So the first word we're going to think about is the word elegy. And an elegy is a lament for the dead. Characteristics of an elegy, well, you'd have a tone of sadness and melancholy, a reflection on mortality, the nature of being human, the fact that our death is inevitable. There's generally a tribute to the deceased person. And towards the end of the poem, we often have a transition from grief to consolation. So there might be references to flowers, to nature, to new growth, to life starting again. Your job then, stop the video, and I want you to think of any poems that you've read, you might have studied them for GCSE, which could be an elegy, which could be a lament for the dead, and then some non-examples, so poems which are definitely not laments for the dead. So take a minute or so, jot down your examples and non-examples, think through all of your GCSE poems, any of the poems you've studied for the A-level, and then start the video again when you're ready. Here's my examples then. So Eden Rock by Charles Cosley is on the GCSE course. That is a poem which remembers the poet's parents as much younger people and then kind of looks forward to him rejoining them in heaven. And there's a wonderful poem called In Memoriam by Tennyson, which is in memory of one of his friends. Elegy in a Country Graveyard, which I've already mentioned in this video, and Marked with D, which is about Harrison's father, which again I've already mentioned in the video. Some non-examples then. So I've chosen both of these poems because they feature death, but they are not elegies. So Porphyria's Lover, for example, by Robert Browning, is a poem that lots of people know. In that poem, there's a man who murders his girlfriend. Like that is not an elegy. It's not written in memory of the girl. It's a dramatic monologue, so it's a story rather than being kind of a real life scenario. And there's no kind of sense of sadness or melancholy or tribute to the person who's dead. It's a poem about a murder, essentially. Isabella and the Pot of Basil by Keats. Again, it's about a murder that happens. It's not in memory of somebody. It's not a real story. It's not in tribute to someone that Keats knew. It's a scenario that he has invented for the poem. So those will be our non-examples. Another new word for us then is iconoclastic, and this means attacking beliefs, traditions, or institutions. So, an icon traditionally is a religious object. It might be a picture of a saint or whatever, and to be iconoclastic would be to destroy that religious object, and then that's come to mean attacking various beliefs and traditions. So, in terms of characteristics, it would be aggressive, it would be angry, there would be a rejection of tradition, challenging authority, recreation or subversion of traditional forms or structures. So, for example, Tony Harrison subverts the Lord's Prayer in Marked with D. He says, I get from earth my daily bread, rather than I get from heaven my daily bread. There might be some violent language, there might be profanities, and so on. Okay, so this time when you pause the video and think of your examples and non-examples, I want you to think specifically about what you've learned to do with Tony Harrison. So come up with examples from his other poems where he is being iconoclastic, where he is attacking beliefs and traditions and so on, and then come up with some non-examples of moments in his poetry where he's not actually attacking something. Okay, so pause the video, take about a minute to do that, and then come back to the video again. Right, here we go. Subverting the Lord's Prayer. So I mentioned that before, that's in Marked with D. Reshaping the sonnet form. So Tony Harrison takes a sonnet form, which was traditionally 14 lines, traditionally about romantic love, and he totally reshapes that. He adds some extra lines in, and he makes it about love for his community rather than romantic love. We've already seen some colloquialisms and profanities in his poems. I know when I read many of his poems to my classes, when we come to words like pissed and so on, there's a bit of a ripple. Then he's got direct and offensive language, such as the example on the screen, which is from Them and Us. Some non-examples then from wider poetry would be Eden Rock and Mother Any Distance, which are on the GCSE course. You know, these are not iconoclastic poems in any way. They are poems which kind of reflect on the nature of human relationships. If we're thinking more closely about Tony Harrison's poems, there are aspects of Marked with D where he shows real kind of sympathy for his father. You know, it's not iconoclastic. He's not attacking his father. He's attacking English society, and he seems really quite sympathetic towards his father's situation. Or in Working by Tony Harrison, it's not iconoclastic in terms of how he describes Patience Kershaw. He wants to dignify her and humanize her. What he's iconoclastic towards is the society that has put Patience in this terrible situation that she's in. Another term then, so pastoral poetry. So this genre often focuses on nature, the countryside. There's a sense of contemplation or reflection, and we've often got beautiful natural landscapes as a backdrop. Characteristics then, so a tone of reflection and meditation. Pastoral poetry is often quite quiet. A natural setting, and that natural world is associated with innocence, with simplicity, whilst the city would be associated with corruption. And then we have idealization of the past, as in, you know, things used to be better when life was simpler, when we used to kind of live more closely with the lands, that kind of thing. We used to grow our own vegetables and all of that, you know, an idealization of past situations. Okay, so same thing, pause the video, come up with some examples and non-examples, and then start the video again, and I'll talk you through mine. Okay, as always, in these videos, your examples might be different from mine. That is absolutely fine. It doesn't mean that they're wrong. It's just there's so many things in English literature to get your teeth into that I will probably give different examples to what you've done. So for examples, I've come up with Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth, which is a beautiful poem where he visits this kind of really nice natural landscape, and he's kind of reflecting on his identity in relation to that. Land of Dreams by Bronte as well. The Bronte poems are often quite pastoral because it's got this kind of beautiful Yorkshire landscape in the background. Non-examples, so I've taken these from the GCSE course. Sing Song would be a non-example. It is not pastoral. When he mentions the natural world, he talks about rowing on a boat through Putney, through London, and he's using it to describe kind of sexual activity rather than talking about reflecting and meditating in the natural world. Porphyria's Lover, that I've already mentioned. Now I've chosen that because there is a real focus on the natural world in that poem. but it's not kind of calm and reflective. The natural world is destroying itself. There's a huge storm going on in the background of that poem. The Farmer's Bride I've chosen as well because it's a natural poem. However, it's not pastoral. So in The Farmer's Bride, there's a farm where the girl is married off to a farmer. She's married off to him at quite a young age, and she's compared to being like a mouse, to being like a leveret, to being like a baby hare, to being like a little bird. And all of those natural images are there in that poem, but it's not calm and it's not reflective because it's a really exploitative relationship. So when you're thinking about whether a poem is pastoral or not, think about, yes, it has nature, but is it reflective? Is it calm? Is it contemplative? Is it meditative? If not, then it's probably not a pastoral poem. And that's one of the things that we see with Tony Harrison's iconoclastic approach to poetry, is he takes the pastoral genre and he's subverting it. So, like in Marked with D, he subverts the Lord's Prayer. In V, he subverts pastoral poetry. This poem is set on the top of a hill in a graveyard. We would expect that kind of calm, contemplative, natural kind of sense in the poem, and that's not what we get. We get anger. So he's subverting the pastoral genre. Right, little pause point there because I've just given you lots of information. There's 3 words on the screen there, which we've just talked about. I want you to pause the video and test yourself. So can you remember the definitions of the words, and then check that against your notes to make sure you've got it right. And then can you put the words in a sentence? And I put 3 sentence starters there for you to help you with that. Okay, so once you've had a go practicing that, start the video again. Right, final thing we're going to talk about is the poetic structure of the poem. So throughout V, we have an internal dialogue. So we have one character who's the educated, middle class Tony Harrison, the grown up who's been through grammar school and university and has been removed from his working class origins. And then we have an alternative version of Tony Harrison, as in what would have happened if he hadn't gone to grammar school. Well, he would probably have become one of the skinheads that he talks about in his other poems. So we have this kind of main poet, and then we have the alter ego, who's the skinhead, this alternative life that Harrison might have had. And the alter ego, the skinhead, attacks poetry, and he says it's totally futile, it's totally worthless, and the educated poet defends poetry. So when you're reading the poem, the educated, grown-up, mature Tony Harrison, that's most of the poem. And then the skinhead voice comes through when it goes into italics. So you'll see that if you flick through your copy of the poem, it goes into italics sometimes. And that is the voice of the skinhead alter ego arguing with the poet. So these are the 2 halves of Harrison's identity, the kind of educated middle class poet, and then the what might have been if I hadn't gone to grammar school character. Okay, we're going to stop there. I'm going to do another video where we're doing a little bit more analysis of the text itself. This was just a kind of introduction to the poem. Go back to your Cornell notes, make sure you complete your keyword summary and then your sentence summary as well. Thank you very much.